So yeah, as Morgan was saying, it's a very exciting day today at the ITC Colloquium. We have a true double header, so I will try to keep the intro short. So our speaker is Prichard, who is currently a postdoc at the Space Telescope Science Institute and got her PhD at Oxford not that long ago, like a couple of years ago. So Laura is an observer who studies the formation and evolution of galaxies and mostly has been using large ground-based spectroscopic facilities to study kind of galaxy populations all the way from the local universe to higher redshifts. And in the first part of the talk, we'll hear about her most recent work on studying the ionizing Lyman continuum galaxies at redshifts of 4. At the same time, Laura has been very much involved in improving the outcomes of astronomical meetings. And so we are very fortunate to have her here for this two-part talk. And then the second part, she will be talking about the future of astronomical conferences. So without further ado, Laura, please take it ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay. Okay, so thank you so much, Morgan and Anna, for inviting me to give this split talk on two incredibly challenging topics in astronomy. So I'll spend the first about 10 minutes talking about my research, with probably time for a quick question, and then we'll move on to the big topic of astronomical conferences. So the original title for this talk was Spectroscopic Confirmation of Escaping Ionizing Flux from Individual High-redshift Galaxies. But as a testament to just how challenging this area of astronomy is, some significant developments just in the last week have meant the results of this work has slightly changed. So the talk, I'm going to pivot slightly today and give you an honest depiction of really how challenging this work is. And after years of work, you may not actually come away with any clear results. So the talk I'm giving today is the elusive nature of Lyman continuum flux. So this project focused on the identification of galaxies like this that emit ionizing UV radiation. So these galaxies likely played the biggest role in the reionization of the universe, transforming it from neutral to almost completely ionized. So as you can see in the figure, these galaxies have a central galaxy outflowing ionizing radiation and neutral clouds of material that surround it. Any ionizing photon that escapes this galaxy is typically called a Lyman continuum photon, as they're emitted below the Lyman break at wavelengths shorter than 912 angstroms. So these ionizing photons are hoovered up by any neutral material. And as such, at redshifts greater than 5, the density of the intergalactic medium is such that it actually acts as an opaque veil, which obscures our view of cosmic reionization as it blocks this radiation. So while we can't look back to cosmic reionization itself, we can look back to galaxies pretty close in time and properties between a redshift of 3 and 5. However, this is an incredibly difficult challenge because first the ionizing photon has to escape the galaxy itself, then it has to travel across most of the age of the universe without coming into contact with any neutral clouds of material until we can observe it at Earth. So while these are our best hope of placing observational constraints on the epoch of reionization, they are an elusive population of galaxies that present numerous observational challenges. As such, there's been a string of bad luck in this field of false or not widely accepted detections, and I think I'd maybe put myself in that category now. So to date, there are only a handful of spectroscopic detections of leaking Lyman continuum from individual galaxies. So how do we go about searching for these galaxies and why are they so hard to find? So here I'm showing a plot of a typical Lyman break galaxy. So it shows the signature Lyman break below 912 angstroms. There's no flux as these photons are absorbed typically. There's a strong Lyman alpha line and a Balmer break around 4,000 angstroms. In this plot overlaid, I'm showing different photometric bands. These are the HST bands used in the CANDLE survey. And these span from rest far ultraviolet wavelengths through to the near infrared. So most star-forming galaxies at high redshift have a spectrum that look pretty similar to something like this. Now, an incredibly powerful method for finding high redshift objects is something called the Lyman break technique, and this was pioneered by Chuck Steidel in 1996. So instead of relying on very deep, expensive spectroscopy to find high redshift objects, you can instead just use multi-bands of images to identify them efficiently. So a galaxy will actually disappear from an image when a band samples below that Lyman break. So with these 3 HST bands that I've highlighted here, you can actually span below the Lyman break and at redshifts greater than 2.4, 3.1, and 4.4 respectively. So you can use these bands to really take you all the way up to that observable limit of redshift of 5. However, an important question to ask is, if you add flux below the Lyman break, is this galaxy always identifiable as a Lyman break galaxy? Another question to ask is our Lyman break galaxy selections actually missing some potential Lyman continuum galaxies? And this was really what we set out to test this hypothesis. So in order to identify a Lyman continuum galaxy, you need 2 bits of information. You need the redshift and a method of identifying any leaking Lyman continuum flux. So what we needed to do to really test this was to identify a redshift of high population, a population of high redshift galaxies without relying on the Lyman break technique for their redshifts. So for this, we targeted the Cosmos field, as it has 30 bands of deep imaging, including deep IR 4-star bands that were used in the ZForge survey to get their photo Zs. And ZForge was really the ideal survey here because these medium IR bands thoroughly sampled the Balmer break, as shown here on the figure on the right, without having to solely rely on the Lyman break that we're not sure if these galaxies may have. So this extra sampling results in very accurate redshifts with errors of less than 2% and minimal catastrophic errors. And so we've also compiled extra information from the Candle survey, Cosmos, and also any extra spec Zs that were already in the literature. So we have a method of accurate redshifts, and all that's needed then is a method to efficiently detect any leaking Lyman continuum flux. For this, we have deep HST images that span below that Lyman break at redshifts greater than 3.1 or 4.4 respectively for F336W and 435W. And you can see our 4 untargeted fields in the HST pointings in the large Cosmos field on the left there. We are in the regime that every pixel counts to identify these often very faint ionizing sources at high redshift. So for this, I made several improvements to the wide field camera 3 UVIS reduction to clean these images up far beyond what's publicly available from MAST. So here's just a quick example that was used in another project. This is a nearby spiral. So my reduction removes gradients in the images, offsets, blotchy patterns, divots, and also noise. And Space Telescope's actually adopted many of my improvements as standard in their pipeline. So you'll be able to download much improved data from MAST really in the coming days. It's coming online very soon. So with these newly reduced images, we then visually inspected 400 galaxies that were in the right redshift range such that our images would probe leaking Lyman continuum flux. And these high resolution HST images help to identify any low redshift contaminants. So did this less biased approach work? So we thought so. Here are our top 3 Lyman continuum galaxy candidates. So each row shows a different object in all the available photometric bands, and the Lyman continuum is on the left, and there's actually a combined image shown by the yellow labels here, a noise equalized image, and then we get their segmentation maps on the right, and these are the footprints we use for flux extraction. So in order to confirm their true nature, we require spectroscopic redshifts to really nail down those ZForge redshifts. And this turned out to be an incredibly challenging bit of work to do. So my collaborators have been pioneering this work for about the last 8 years, and I've joined for the last 3. And some version of this project has been awarded about 23 nights of telescope time, most of that on Keck over the last 8 years. But unfortunately, due to poor weather, only about 10% of that time has actually been usable. So in January of 2020, we did manage to get some spectra, but unfortunately it was in kind of less than ideal conditions. And so the results are pretty inconclusive. So that's what I'm going to show you today. So here's one of those inconclusive spectra. This is one of our brightest objects. Here's a smoothed LRIS spectrum in black, and there's an LBG composite just laid over the top in blue there. This is an interesting object, and even with this slightly ratty spectra, I do believe this redshift. But as you can see from the images, this is actually a double source. It has an optically bright component that you can see in the F814W image that's slightly to the left, whereas the Lyman continuum component in F336W is slightly to the right. And unfortunately, because of the LRIS slit position, we really only can resolve that optically bright component. We just kind of miss that fainter Lyman continuum component. So we don't really know what this object is, but at redshift of 4.37, which is where we spectroscopically confirmed it at, this would be a 10 sigma Lyman continuum detection, and this flux is actually detected well below the Lyman break. And so I think the most likely explanation for this object would be a low-Z contaminant. So this more agnostic approach is certainly very effective at getting viable LCG candidates, and we have a sizable population. But with this bad luck in the spectroscopic follow-up, we can't yet say if this method actually yields results yet. So in conclusions, this is an incredibly challenging area of astronomy that requires deep HST imaging, spectroscopic follow-up in good conditions, and we have just resubmitted our NASA Keck proposal for the most recent run that was weathered out, so please wish us luck for next year. And even with no clear results, I think this is a worthwhile investigation into this less explored parameter space. I'll just pause there for a question.
Thank you so much, Laura. This is, thank you for making us appreciate how hard this actually is. And if people have questions, please drop me a note in the chat, and I will kick things off. With the questions about this object you just presented as a Lyman continuum candidate. And so you said that you think it's most likely that because it's physically displaced from the kind of where the bulk of the optical detection is, that it's likely an interloper. And so I was wondering, why is what kind of object would that be, since it's not really detected in other bands as strongly? Would it still be an interesting object, or is there just kind of a known class of contaminants?
Yeah, this is a really good point. And obviously you have to be pretty damn unlucky to get a contaminant like bang over the top of another object. But the way that we're selecting these objects, we're kind of prone to find the freaks in this whole sample when you look in the UV. And so it's not too surprising that, we're kind of biased towards these really rare cases. And one genuine feeling when we first saw this object is that it could actually be a merger at the same redshift. And you can imagine in a merger where a lot of the CGM is displaced and distorted, that could be prime conditions for really getting that ionizing flux out of that system so that we could see it. But you'd also have to be along a really clean line of sight to that object as well, which, again, this is the selection method that would find that type of system. But I think in the images I showed, it does look slightly confusing why you're only seeing the UV component, but bear in mind, those are all scaled relatively for each band. And so I'm going to be doing some analysis really just on those pixels with where the UV component is, just to see if I can really get the flux measurements of just that object and these other bands. So we'll yet to see if it is really weird or just a kind of, happenstance.
Just medium weird. Okay. It looks like Peppy has the question about the other components. So Peppy, please go ahead and unmute.
It's actually me. We're on her. So, but whatever you get, even if there's interlopers like this, you've at least got an upper limit on the Z=4 leakage if you had enough objects. And I wondered if that was getting to be interesting yet, or.
Yeah, very, very good point. And so a collaborator of mine, Uroš Mestrik, actually recently submitted a paper just on that. So compiled a lot of the non-detections, and he just transitioned to a new job in a different country in a pandemic. So it will be resubmitted at some point. But so yeah, it's definitely an important thing. And honestly, in this work, you can find a really rare object, and they exist like Ion 3 and. But how much can they really tell you? Because each system is so different and they're so rare and hard to find. And we really need to get the numbers up in order to place some good constraints on those kind of really rare objects. But I think the most promising kind of direction for this field are those upper limits. And so there's definitely been a kind of a growing body of work heading in that direction. So thanks. So I want to keep it moving because we've got a lot of content to cover today. But please feel free to send me an email if you have further questions on science stuff.
We do have a couple of other questions, so maybe,
Okay.
I think we pay really well into this. Oh, Charlotte, can you go ahead, please?
Hi, Laura, that was very nice. I was just wondering, just following up on that question, if you had, if there was anything you could say about the properties of the candidates related to the upper limits. I mean, if the sample is big enough to say like, oh, these types of galaxies seem to have, you know, higher limits than others or anything at this point.
Yeah, well, so I mean, my collaborator has run these 3 candidates, assuming they're at the right redshift, and obviously that's a big caveat, run them through as codes for determining escape. And the results from that are, it's quite unlikely that they are genuine detections, but if they are, it would be an escape fraction of around 100%, which I know sounds a bit crazy, but at least it's not over 100%. That a lot of detections are really, and so that's, yeah, we kind of get these like glimmers of information from these very few sample, you know, very small sample, but yeah, I guess kind of the limits of the non-detections will be something as well I can include in the paper.
Okay, so I just meant the like properties of those galaxies. So are they particularly low mass or high mass? Or
they are, that each one is a very different system. One, I'm like, is that even a galaxy? You know, so they are strange. So yeah, but yeah, good question.
Okay, to close off this section, I think Nelson has a kind of forward-looking question. So please go ahead, Nelson.
Or maybe maybe backward. Yeah, it's just a technical question of is Keck the only game in town? Is there any way of getting, you know, similar quality data from VLT or GTC or even some of the smaller telescopes?
Yeah, so we put in an LBT proposal because the key here is that you need a very blue instrument. So we use LRIS because it can really capture those blue wavelengths, and the location of Keck means that, you know, the seeing is good, and you know the atmosphere is just that much thinner that you can just get more of that blue flux through. Unfortunately, all the LBT time was completely weathered out as well. The dome didn't even open. So, but the VLT is another option as well. And my collaborators applied for time down there because they're Australian. They're in Australia, so they have access there. And so yeah, there are some other things you can do, but yeah, it's kind of limited, and they've had some issues from VLT as well. So. It feels like this project is doomed to fail.
We're all suffering the same, yes.
It's tough. It's tough. Okay, awesome.
Well,
should I move on?
There are actually more questions, but yeah, let's move on, and then
we've got some ground to cover. But please do email me, and yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions after as well. Okay, so now changing topic quite a bit. Switching to part 2 of this colloquium. And I will say that when I was first invited to give this talk, I was pretty intimidated by the subject. While I've spent a lot of time thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion within conferences, this is a big and multifaceted subject that extends way beyond even that. So this talk is really meant to serve as a starting point for a conversation that should definitely continue. I will say that I will be covering some difficult and potentially triggering subjects, really just to lay the groundwork for the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to acknowledge that I have a lot of privilege as an educated white woman, and that I do have a narrow-lived set of experiences, especially through the pandemic. So whilst I'm continuously trying to educate myself of others' experiences, I may miss things or I may misstep and cause harm. And if that is the case, please do let me know. So firstly, why are we having this conversation now? Well, 2020 was the year that everyone's plans changed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Jobs changed overnight. People were immediately cut off from friends and family, while others were forced to go to work and risk their lives every day to keep the country running or to save others. And parents were left to figure out how to homeschool their kids overnight or balance full-time jobs alongside full-time childcare, while others were really just fighting to get through the day with no means of income or support. To date, over 3 million lives have been lost to COVID-19, and many others have been lost to very challenging situations during this time. That's relatives, friends, neighbors, and loved ones. Just a couple of months into the pandemic, we all witnessed the horrifying death of George Floyd by police, and marches for Black life swept the nation and beyond, and those with privilege who've had the privilege to ignore the oppression of Black people really started to open their eyes. Only Tuesday did we get the long-awaited guilty verdict of murder by police. And while this did bring some relief and maybe even hope, it does not bring back the life that was lost. There's also been a rise in ignorant rhetoric throughout the pandemic that's seen a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. And all of these attacks on Black and Asian communities have also existed on top of the effects of the pandemic that we know have had a disproportionate effect on different communities of color in varied ways. So our colleagues of color, especially Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian, are dealing with the hurt to their communities as well as the effects of the pandemic, whilst also working in a field that is not diverse, inclusive, or equitable. So this will only compound the issues that they face. So let's take a look at some of the inequities within our field and how the pandemic has affected them. I will just say that conversations of inequity are often centered on women, and this is, even though, you know, that is not balanced either, it's because there are enough women that you can actually track statistical trends. But this means that communities of color, LGBTQIA+ people, non-binary people, people with disabilities are left out of the conversation altogether, which is a real issue and just shows how broken this field is that we don't have that data available. So when we do look at these trends, just bear in mind that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. So 1 year into the pandemic, these figures show the change in how academics spend their time. And it's clear that the pandemic has changed a lot for both men and women. So on the left, you can see women in blue, men in pink. And on average, women have lost more time to research and spend more time on childcare and household chores. And on the right, you see loss of time spent on research by age of youngest child, and women are losing more time across the board. And for the youngest children, this can equate to almost 1 day of work a week. So here are some other trends as well. I've compiled a lot of references and resources in making this talk, so I'll send a document round afterwards. So the path is even rockier for scientists of color who encounter other biases in the workplace and now have to deal with the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on Black and Latino communities. And then a couple of other papers have found that women are submitting fewer papers and are left out of more recent research. Well, on average, men are actually submitting more papers. Recent modeling by Lisa Cooley in Australia found that it would take until 2080 for them to achieve 30% of women within their professional astronomers. So the pandemic has forced us all to stop business as usual, and it's also starkly exposed and worsened the inequities in society and the field. But the pandemic also creates a valuable opportunity to redesign a field and create a field that can sustain long into the future with full buy-in from the most marginalized communities. And if you think this sounds a bit grandiose, we'll talk about conferences, then I hope to convince you that this is right where we need to be having this conversation. So let's take a step back. And when you're starting to build anything, it's important to look at the very core of what you're trying to achieve. So what is our ultimate goal in astronomy? I think most answers to this question can boil down to some version of discover the secrets of the universe and understand our place in it. And what do we need to achieve this? Well, at its most basic level, we need ideas and resources. So ideas can come from some combination of innovative thinking, fresh perspectives, and knowledge of the field, while the resources that we need to work on this include data, equipment, time, money, and training. We tie these two together through networking and collaboration. So the best way to tie fresh perspectives and knowledge of the field together is through diversity and inclusion. And the most efficient way to distribute the resources to work on these ideas is through equity. We tie all of this together through conferences. These are valuable, regular opportunities to boost ideas and increase access to resources to push the field forward. So a few words on the trifecta that is diversity, inclusion, and equity. In the historically white and male-centered fields such as astronomy, these words can often be used as code words, and so I just want to try and redefine them in the truest sense of the words. So beyond the fact that it's only right that everyone have equal access to opportunities, research has shown that ethnic diversity in a group actually increases its scientific productivity. Close intercultural relationships increase creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship, while racial diversity in a group actually makes everyone smarter. So diversity exists along many axes, and I've already highlighted some: race, ethnicity, and gender. But there's a vast array of axes that diversity can exist along in a group, and I've just highlighted some of those here. So, sorry, one moment. Inclusion is not culture fit, it's culture add. So thinking not of assimilation, but of expansion and evolution. And there are serious ramifications for not committing to inclusion. Microaggressions such as passing comments, perceived stupid questions, or stupid jokes and perceived harmless questions. These all add up, and they're often referred to as death by 1,000 cuts. Studies have consistently shown that experiencing persistent microaggressions actually damages people's health due to constant elevated stress of navigating non-inclusive environments. So inclusion takes a lot of work, and it's required of everyone, but it's especially required of those that benefit from existing power structures. And then finally, equity is not an equal share. It's an ongoing process that involves continuously identifying and removing barriers to ensure equal access to opportunities. So given the systemic oppression within our society, this is a course correction within the field so that we can ensure everyone can play on an equal playing field within astronomy. So these are three simple, powerful, interlinked concepts that do not work in isolation. A workplace that's diverse, equitable, and inclusive is one where everybody benefits, it's the most healthy, and it leads to innovation. And conferences provide valuable opportunities to enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field. So this was the guiding principle behind this initiative by the Women in Astronomy Forum at the Space Telescope Science Institute that I led back in 2019. So the idea was to survey the sizable cohort of research staff. So we had 83 responses, around half the research staff, on their ability to attend conferences, and this turned into an Astro 2020 white paper. So we asked 27 questions that spanned three main areas: factors motivating people to attend conferences, factors limiting their attendance at conferences, and any practices that would have facilitated their participation. We asked some optional demographic questions to see if there were any trends in these responses with gender identity, year since PhD, racial identity, ethnic identity, relationship status, English as a first language, and number of dependents, as well as some others. And I will just highlight some glaring issues with the demographic distributions of the survey respondees. So the binary gender, although it's actually relatively representative of STScI's workforce, it's well below that of society. And also, none of the respondees identified as non-binary or gender non-conforming, and that really places a serious limit that this data just isn't captured in this survey. Another major issue is that the respondees are not racially or ethnically diverse, which places even more significant limitations on the results. The results were analysed in aggregate form and for the demographic data where we had enough information. So please bear these limitations in mind. So in aggregate, we found that the factors limiting people's attendance were lack of time, travel funds, or too many conferences to attend. And then the practices that aided participation helped inform the key recommendations, which were to offer remote participation, ensure diverse representation of conferences, and offer flexible funding for dependent care support, and then offer additional funding for travel. So I'll just dive into each one of these recommendations and a bit more information on the motivation behind each. So the first is strive for two-way remote participation at every conference. So two-way is something like Zoom, where you can present remotely, you can ask questions, you can be involved in discussions. And the motivation for this is that we found 43% of women, compared with just 28% of men, said that remote participation would have helped them participate in a conference. The additional benefit is that this benefits all underrepresented groups, and with our intensive year of training during the pandemic, there's really no excuse as to why we can't offer this anymore. It also has significant environmental benefits. So the second recommendation is that you should select diverse organising committees, contributors, and attendees. And a tip for success here is to invite more researchers, more junior researchers with marginalised identities. So the motivation behind this was that we found that 78% of men received between 1 and 11 invitations over the last 3 years, compared with 52% of women. And the plot on the right shows the fraction of invitations accepted with women in orange and men in blue, and we found that women were more likely to accept the invitations that they'd received. But an interesting point here is that we found that a few senior women received many more invitations than anyone else. So what this means is that conference organizers may feel that they're doing their due diligence by inviting the most well-established, and as a result, often most overburdened women that are more likely to reject the offer. Meanwhile, junior women were actually being excluded, and they were the ones more likely to accept the invitations anyway. Another important point is that 22% more women said that more diverse representation at conferences would have actually encouraged them to attend. So optics really matter when you're putting together a conference. And there are existing tools for selecting more diverse participants and contributors in less biased ways. And I'll share those resources after. So the third recommendation is to provide flexible funding for any additional costs incurred as a part of participating in a conference. So the key word here is flexible. This really gives researchers the freedom to find the best option that works for them. And the motivation for this was that women with dependents, shown in the red line here, didn't apply for around 6 conferences that they were interested in, compared to 3 for men with dependents, shown in dark blue. And then women and men with no dependents didn't apply to the same number that they were interested in, which was 2. So this recommendation benefits a wide range of astronomers, from those with children to those with non-self-sufficient relatives. And then the fourth recommendation is to allocate institutional or conference funding for people to attend conferences. So the main reason for 42% of people for not attending conferences was the lack of funding. And this funding can be used equitably. You can provide funding for specific underrepresented groups, invited speakers, or students. So given the limitations of the white paper, I wanted to draw in some more recommendations from an expert outside of astronomy on how to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion with a focus on race. So the recommendations that were presented were: don't look for experts by title. So we already know that this field is not diverse or equitable. And set an ambitious and audacious goal for diversity. This includes everyone on the organizing committees through to everyone participating in the conference. Ask for speaker recommendations from a diverse group. This is a lot easier to do if you have a diverse organizing committee. And pay your speakers, at least for an academic conference, cover the costs of their attendance. Do not always enlist people of color to speak about diversity issues, and pass the baton. If you find that you're being consistently invited to talks and you're from a pretty well-represented group, recommend a speaker from an underrepresented group. Use your sponsorship privilege. Don't endorse a conference that's not diverse. And finally, refuse to speak at or attend a homogeneous event. So whilst I was wrapping up the white paper, planning for the Inclusive Astronomy 2 meeting at Space Telescope in October of 2019 was well underway. So I ended up as a local organizing committee co-chair after the original chair left the field. And as a test case, I attempted to implement all of the recommendations from the white paper. So of the 4 white paper recommendations, all but 1 were implementable in the very short timeframe that we left ourselves. An important thing to note is that the meeting did happen, but it fell significantly short of its originally intended goals. And this was due to inexperience, mismanagement, the incredibly short amount of time that we left ourselves, and also missteps along the way that caused harm. So the local organizing committee spent the 9 months after the conference writing a comprehensive document of recommendations based on the lessons that we'd learned. So the high-level recommendations here, and there are many more specifics in the document that I'll send round, most importantly, start a year to a year and a half in advance. For an online conference, I'd recommend at least 9 months to really bake in diversity, equity, and inclusion at the core. Seek involvement from experts and people of many identities in the planning of the conference. Be transparent in decision-making. Utilize resources outside of astronomy. This is so important for lightening the burden of those actually planning the conferences. Accessibility and access should be really involved at every stage of the planning process. And organizing committees can carefully set up planning structures to ensure success, including good communication and multi-level leadership to avoid single point failures. So the white paper and Inclusive Astronomy 2 were all in a pre-pandemic world, and overnight everyone became a remote participant. And the real benefit of that is that video conferencing software and virtual connection tools have rapidly evolved, and virtual conferences are now commonplace. So the question to ask is not what we need to stop, but what's morally responsible to resume. So imagining ahead to a post-pandemic world, you have three basic formats for how a conference could be set up. All in person, hybrid in person, and two-way virtual, and all virtual. So the white paper shows that all in-person conferences do not support diversity, equity and inclusion, and there are many other significant cons. A hybrid conference with a two-way component does have the pros of an in-person conference, and it can support DEI. A con is that it can be hard to connect all your participants, and so this is something that really needs to be worked on. But it's important to facilitate in-person attendance as a primary goal. A virtual component alone should not be a substitute for all the important work that goes into diversity, equity, and inclusion. But from the white paper, we found that people would much rather participate virtually than not at all. And then third, there's an all virtual conference, which is the most supportive of DEI. There are many pros to these. Although you don't get the in-person interactions that you get from in-person, that are a really valuable component of conferences for many people. But an important additional note is that all virtual conferences limit the spread of viruses and disease, which I know is something we've all been thinking a lot about over the last year. So given what we now know and our intense year of virtual training, you should not be setting out to plan an exclusively all in-person meeting anymore. Given adequate planning time, if your venue cannot support a virtual component, you can find another venue. So now onto an important aspect of conferences, which is the environmental impact. So researchers compared the European Astronomical Society meeting, the EAS meeting, the 2019 in-person one and the 2020 virtual one. And they found that the carbon footprint of the virtual meeting was 3,000 times smaller than the in-person meeting, and that the internet-related emissions were negligible. And they found that intercontinental travel of the in-person meeting accounted for around 50% of the travel emissions, which is significant as it's a European meeting and most people are from Europe. So now onto the destination of this talk. What should the future of astronomical conferences look like? An important thing to note here is that environmentally conscious conferences are more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. So some of the suggestions here are taken from that EAS study, the European Astronomical Society study, but they also overlap with the white paper results and the Inclusive Astronomy 2 recommendations as well. Simplifying and localizing conferences means that everybody and the environment benefits, and the pandemic is the perfect time to really adopt policies that create real change. And so we can take the next couple of years to experiment and also document what works and what doesn't. So the first recommendation is what we've already touched upon. Post-COVID-19 conferences should be a mix of purely virtual and hybrid conferences with a two-way virtual component. All conferences should be designed with increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in astronomy as a core function. And this is an iterative process. You can use existing recommendations, build upon them, and pass them along for future organizers so that we can all evolve. A recommendation from the Inclusive Astronomy recommendations and the EAS meeting is to attach smaller satellite meetings to annual conferences. So this reduces barriers of participation by using existing infrastructure, for example, just tagging a meeting onto the end of one of the biannual AAS meetings. An important part of this, and something additional, is that you can lean on the resources outside of astronomy to lighten the burden. For example, use events planners as they do for all AAS meetings. So this is a cool idea. For a global meeting, you could hold it at regional hubs. And this has actually already been done by another field. This lowers the threshold of participation and will undoubtedly facilitate a wider and more diverse group of participants. These regional hubs could be located along public transport routes in locations with many resources nearby, and they can be scheduled to aid participation, for example, within regular work hours. You could have, at any conference, you can have a mix of synchronous and asynchronous talks or pre-sessions, so pre-recorded talks or live discussion sessions. So this really aids global participation and interaction. And you could also centrally schedule all of your conferences, for example, through something like the International Astronomical Union, A third of people from the conference survey said that they couldn't attend conferences because there was just too many to attend. So we can certainly streamline and condense the sheer volume of conferences that we had pre-pandemic to really make sure that every conference is intentional and of real value to maximize its returns. And then in order to reward organizers for their valuable contributions to the field, and also to incentivize sharing this responsibility of this work, we need to properly recognize the work that goes into planning conferences. This could include conference-related acknowledgements and citations through to properly including them in job appraisals. So now onto the discussion part of the talk. Do you have any thoughts on this? Do you have any ideas to throw into the pool? And what do you want to see for the future of astronomical conferences? Thank you so much. And I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing your ideas.
Thanks, Laura. This is really excellent.
Thank you so much.
I'm sure, yeah, people will start chiming in with the questions in the chat. So perhaps just to start, kick things off.
Can I just say one thing first? Sorry to interrupt. As we have this conversation, I want to also talk about like the forum that we're in right now, like colloquia and sort of visits, which have obviously been forced online, but like, I think of this as not a full-on conference, but a like miniature version. So yeah, back to you. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great point that yeah, all of these practices are work beyond conferences as well. My question was regarding the first bubble that appeared here about the hybrid conferences. So I feel like a number of conferences have been successful completely virtually, but it's I guess a little bit unclear of kind of how the in-person versus virtual experience would compare like at the same conference. So could you maybe discuss some of the practices that would kind of enable virtual participants sort of the same level of networking that is kind of just naturally comes out of an in-person attendance of the conference?
Yeah, that's a barrier that certainly needs a lot of work, and that I hinted at before. It's really hard to bring your virtual and your in-person people together. Something we did at Inclusive Astronomy too, I was running the virtual participation, and it was the first time that it had probably been done for a Space Telescope conference. I don't know that was all that successful, but one thing we did was actually have videos of the virtual participants at least at the beginning of the session, so people could see, oh, look, there are actually people online, and then everyone was on the Slack. And so there's kind of ways that you can get people to interact. And we had, I think, maybe 3 virtual presentations. Also, an important thing to note is that some people were saying, yes, I'm definitely not going to be able to make it. Please sign me up as a virtual participant. Some people actually just messaged the day of the meeting saying, I can't come in person. Thank you for giving me virtual participation. Like, I've had a big disaster. Can I just sign on? And so that flexibility is everything. Obviously, I think most people would much rather be in person, get the most out of a conference in that sense. And that's why it should never be used as a substitute for doing all that work to get everyone in the room. But it's great as a backup, and it really helps, as we've seen, more women and I'm sure underrepresented groups of all kinds attend conferences, participate in conferences.
Great. Anna had her hand first, so please go ahead.
Hey, Laura, nice talks. Nice to see you again. I haven't seen you since Inclusive Astronomy. Yeah, this is great. Yeah, I think the pandemic has definitely made people think different, or think a lot more about how to schedule or plan conferences better in this regard. I just wanted to give another couple of ideas too, because a lot of things that you said really resonated. And so just give a couple examples of, basically 2 conferences out of the many I've been to, but these were things I really like. So I went to a conference in 2014 that had a large number of grad students speaking. I think one of the problems is a lot of times grad students, especially young grad students or very early grad students, just kind of assume that they should be doing a poster and this and that. And I think giving a talk and stuff like that and getting more interaction, because we know not everyone's gonna look at your poster, but everyone will listen to your talk. That was really the only meeting I saw that really actually actively made sure they had a lot of grad student talks. One of the disadvantages was they made them shorter. I'm not sure if that was a disadvantage or not, but because they made it 10 minutes rather than 15 minutes, they were able to have a lot more people give a lot more grad students give talks. So that's something I really liked. And the same thing too with the speakers. You know, the Star Formation conferences I go to, it's always the same people. Star Formation is a lot more popular in Europe, so most of the conferences are there. And you know, I always see like the same names on there. And I think there's a big group. You know, when I gave a invited talk to a GMT conference a couple of years ago or a few years ago, and it was, I was like, you know, you looked at the list, and it was like all these young people, you know, postdocs, early faculty, and so on, and it was like 50-50 women and men, and I was like so impressed. I was like, wow, I really like how you guys chose your speakers. And then when I spoke to people at the conference, people on the SOC was like, oh yeah, we wanted to pick people that will actually use the telescope. So what I had thought was not right. So I'm wondering too, if, yeah, having something global where, you know, to try to make it, because I think too, like being invited to give talks, getting talks when you apply for talks, especially when you're young, is a huge confidence boost. And I think, especially now with, you know, I don't even know what the damage like this pandemic is going to do to people's, you know, imposter syndrome and whatnot, being stuck at home for this long. But, you know, have you guys thought about maybe like doing a database, like how, besides this white paper, like how do you kind of expect the rest of the astronomy community to go by these guidelines? Because I feel like it's going to be hard to convince all these SOCs to make their invited lists a lot more diverse right now.
Yeah, but not if the SOC is diverse. And that's the key. It's like the day one, you know,
okay.
It has to be baked into the whole system, because it's just, you're right, it's really hard to convince. And and also, as I've found, creating a really diverse, equitable and inclusive conference is a huge amount of work, and it is a burden that unfortunately disproportionately falls on the most marginalized people in, you know, in the field. And that's why I think an important part of this whole thing is we need to start properly acknowledging that work. And I feel I'm an incredibly privileged person within this whole environment, and I don't really want to do diversity, equity and inclusion work anymore. I'm kind of done with it. And of the Inclusive Astronomy 2 meeting, 3 of those people have left the field now. That were involved in the LOC. It was a bad situation, but like, you know, there's so many things that can be baked in right at the beginning. And that's your thing. Like if it's not right, don't do it. You know, if the first few meetings are going not the direction that it should be going in, don't just plow ahead. Like those corrections have to happen in those first few meetings.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's unfortunate. I mean, I feel like a lot of the talk is DEI is so important, and then people aren't rewarded for putting in those efforts. I mean, I'm sure many of us can say like my, you know, emails for being on panels and conferences, panels and reviewing papers like skyrocketed this year. And I'm sure many others. And I wondered why, you know, and that's hard too, because when I was, because also I think having diverse panels is very important. When I was on a NASA ATP panel, there's probably 10 of us on there, and the only women on that panel was me and another female postdoc. And so it's tough because you need to increase representation in those fields, and the way to do it too is, and to get a more balanced opinion with all these things, is to have a diverse panel or diverse SOC and this and that, but then it always falls to the limited number of people.
So I will say, and something I can't emphasize enough, is leaning on resources outside of the astronomy community, but also even within astronomy. For example, if you're trying to put together a conference at a relatively small institution or a not very diverse institution, you can ask the AAS for input. And we did actually have someone from the working group in accessibility and disability, I think, WGAD from AAS actually advise us. And so that there are resources around within the astronomy community, but also there's a lot of fields who've already just sorted this out. That regional hubs thing was a biology conference, and they asked psychologists to come in and evaluate how well it went. And, you know, I think we can lean on sociologists, we can lean on psychologists as well for getting that type of stuff. And we can lean on more diverse fields for understanding how you increase diversity and stuff. And so that's why I pulled in some other recommendations from outside astronomy. I see some other questions as well.
That's awesome. Maybe we can go to the next question by Jessica.
Hi. I think WGAD actually started pretty much at the first Inclusive Astronomy Conference in 2015. And they were sort of almost not quite an afterthought, but they weren't in the original diversity grouping that started organizing it. I was on the organizing committee for that. But I actually have an organizing committee meeting later today for the, I think the 32nd annual Astronomical Data Analysis Software and Systems Conference, which is very international. And we pivoted to do last year's, which was going to be in Spain, totally online. And we ran into the one big problem you have with doing international conferences online, if literally you have people all the way around the world, is when do you have the meetings? And it was challenging. So we had 3 a day, and they were sort of centered around Eastern Europe, so those people could make it to everything. But that meant we had to sometimes stay up way past midnight or wake up in the middle of the night to go to sessions. And that's a geographic diversity issue that is very hard to deal with.
It can be tough. And one of the points, the one at the bottom left there, is the asynchronous and synchronous sessions, which is obviously something now everyone who has a kid in school is very familiar with. But you know, it allows, you know, yes, there may be some very narrow windows of the day when you can really have a discussion, but everyone can watch everything on their own time on the schedule.
Well, we did have that too. So everything was recorded. But a lot of it is the interaction that you both participate in and hear live, so you can react to people. And what really was missed was the time in between sessions. So it's easy to broadcast and it's hard to do times when everybody can talk. And I think doing some sort of breakout rooms is the way it needs to evolve to, but I haven't seen that really happening yet, where you can really form small discussion groups. I like the idea of smaller local conferences, but in this field, we've always been very international, and it's been really hard. I mean, we literally the last 2 chairs have been women, though, of the program organizing committee, which is our equivalent to the scientific. And we do have quotas, which is a thing that's easier to do in international conferences than in American conferences, I have discovered, because Europeans think about quotas and Americans aren't really allowed to think about quotas. So we have a pretty strict. So our field is more heavily male. I mean, the software field is more heavily male than astronomy in general. And so we do try for 1/3 women everywhere, both in invited speakers and in all people that are giving oral talks, as well as the organizing committee. The program organizing committee, local organizing committees aren't always as well balanced. It depends on who they can get that has time to volunteer. But it's all volunteers too, which makes a difference. So it's easier to pivot a mostly volunteer event because you don't have to charge as much for it to support the infrastructure, which we don't have any of. So thank you for your talk. It was really enlightening.
Thanks.
And have one more hand up. Giovanni, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for this talk. It was quite interesting. I've been on many organizing committees, particularly with the SPIE on instrumentation. And one of the things I think you can do that would help would be to contact the sponsors and the organizers of the conference, and that when they pick the chairs and the organizing committee, they should instruct them on these items that you bring up, diversity, equity, inclusiveness, and instruct them that these items must be included when they organize it, and that way, I think you could also get some unity and more action occurring. Okay.
That's a really interesting point, and money is so important in this situation. If you have a grant that has in it stipulated this needs to be a diverse conference, along these axes, that speaks volumes, and will ultimately really help conferences thrive when the money says that that's the way it's supposed to be. Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm making notes, by the way.
Yeah. Well, if we were told by the sponsors that you had to have these items in your talk, that we would tend to follow that. Because they're sponsored, they picked you, and I think that's really the key. If you can get them to, or in a grant to specify that if you're organizing a conference that these things be in it, that would go a long way. Okay, thanks, and thanks for being so for bringing all these items up. I think they're great.
Thanks.
Okay, have maybe final Bill.
Hi, I just wanted to add, to follow up on Giovanni's note, that it would be great to let the IAU know, because they sponsor a huge number of meetings, symposia, all around the world. And if they had your ideas in their guidelines, they would automatically go out to all the sponsors, all the organizing committees, and would even be part of the guidelines to the people who are proposing for the meetings. So that would be a fabulous way to spread your ideas very, very widely. Thank you for a fabulous talk.
Thanks, that's a really good idea. It's hard because I've both completely burnt out by diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and it's definitely impacted my science output. But then it's also like, well, now I'm one of many people who's done quite a lot of work and then can provide the information. So I'm always caught halfway out the door with this. But I appreciate everyone's feedback. Yeah, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak on this.
Well, with that, let's thank Lara all together one more time. We are going to stop the recording at this point, but those of you who would like to